is a business and market-oriented group. Next to him we have Steve Hall, who is the CEO of CNBC Arabia. Next to Steve we have Martha Hamilton. She is a former reporter, columnist, editor for the Washington Post. She now writes a column for the AARP in the United States. And next to her we have Professor Mohammed Arif. He is the executive director of the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research. And Hu Shuli is there. She is a founding editor of Zhaijing magazine. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's broken many stories, and it's China's leading business and magazine. And let's start with that question. First of all, how many of you believe that the business media, raise your hands, did a good job before the financial crisis broke? How many of you believe they did a good job? Only about 3 or 4 hands are going out. How many of you believe they could have done a better job? Raise your hands. Yeah, I think that's a common feeling. And I want to start with you, Martha. You know, basically, why don't you think the media did a better job before the crisis broke?
There were a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a very busy time for the business media, and we were all over the place covering other stories. We were covering the fallout from the last scandal. You know, we were in courtrooms watching Martha Stewart and Ken Lay trying to save their hides. And we were trying to figure out this new guy at the Federal Reserve, a guy named Ben Bernanke. We were worrying about sovereign wealth funds and the mutual fund scandal. So we were really very busy. On the other hand, there were a lot of stories done about elements that would come together in the crisis. There were quite a few stories done about the housing bubble. There were stories done about the increasing leverage in the economy. There were stories about subprime mortgages. And there were stories about these complicated new financial instruments, including credit derivative swaps. But what we didn't do is step back and systematically look at all these different things and figure out how they were connected.
Yeah, Martha raises a very interesting point here. I want to read you something. Dean Starkman is not a name that many of us would have known, but he runs The Audit, which is an online critique of the business press for the Columbia Journalism Review, which is a very, very respected publication out of the United States. Now, what he did was he analyzed more than 700 articles. He analyzed more than 700 articles that had been written between 2000 and 2007 that warned readers about problems developing in the US economy, where the epicenter of this crisis was, right? And he concluded that even in articles that did question the mortgage bubble, the press did not understand. The press did not understand the vast scope of the business practices that led to the financial disasters. And as a result, the press did not hold Wall Street accountable, and Wall Street saw no need to enlighten the press. You know, in his words, the stories written were necessary, but not sufficient. And let me just give you one quote here from a very well-known journalist, Floyd Norris of the New York Times, the chief financial correspondent for the New York Times. And Martha Hamilton, you had written a very interesting piece on what we learned from the meltdown. He's one of the persons that you interviewed, and I want to take a quote from that article. Because he basically had warned about the financial bubble, he had warned about overstretched homeowners, what this could mean to the stability of the financial system. But even doing all this, this is what he had to say, and he's one of the leading US journalists on business. Quote, "What I should have known and didn't was that, I did not take the time to understand the intricacies of collateralized debt obligations. I did not take the time to understand that. What I should have known and didn't was that this amounted to financial alchemy to turn risky assets into risk-free assets, or at least to mostly fund risky assets with risk-free assets." So here's one of the best journalists in the United States admitting that he couldn't connect all the dots. And so I think that was a fundamental problem as to why the media didn't do a better job. Do you think, Shuli, that they could have done a better job?
I think being an independent media in China, we are very confident, and we have done the right job before and during the crisis. And we have been taken as a doomsayer in China for years. And when China's economic growth was like 2 digits growth, we, the editorial board of our magazine, issued a very stern warning talking about the excessive liquidity in financial sector and the fundamental problems in unbalanced structural economy. And that was really worrying. It was in early 2006. And when the stock market in China was like taking notes, there was massive call from the market asking the government to bail out. And we issued editorial to say that there's no reason for government to bail out, to intervene in the market. The market comes up, surely goes up, surely comes down. And there's no reason to intervene in market, no need to intervene in market. And it's unnecessary, and there won't be good result if the government intervenes in the market.
Now, you may have warned about the market, which is on the plus side, but were you writing a lot about the housing bubble in the United States? Because this is really where a lot of the problem was.
Yeah, of course, we take ourselves as a watchdog of the Chinese market and the Chinese economy. We put China into the international context and concern a lot. Once the real crisis came in the US, it was in middle of 2007, and it's the summer of 2007 when the subprime crisis started. And we believe it would be a very, very big event to the world as well as to China. At that time, a lot of Chinese, a lot of observers in different perspectives in China thought that China could decouple with the United States. It means that U.S. could beat its own problems, but China could escape from this crisis. We didn't believe that.
That's a great point that Shuli's making right there, because I can tell you as a journalist, even a lot of very serious economists on Wall Street were talking about this ability for the emerging markets to basically decouple from whatever crisis was going to happen in the US, that their growth would continue regardless of what happened in the United States. And as we know profoundly, this wasn't the case. Even here in the Mideast, the IMF came out with a warning yesterday about what growth is going to be. They think it's going to be about 2.6% this year. Now, you may disagree with that, but it's clear oil revenues are down, so there's been a profound global impact. And Mohammed, I think that was one of the big things that the international media failed to realize, was this myth that basically the Asian world and the Mideast, for instance, could decouple from what was going on in the United States.
Ted, to me it was no big surprise that the media did not pay much attention to this crisis while it was in the making. Because this crisis has been in the making for more than a decade, and in fact, a couple of decades, and with the epicenter in the United States. And the US, of course, was consuming more than it was producing. It was saving too little, spending too much, importing too much, importing more than exporting, and so on and so forth. There were serious fault lines in the global economy, which are not perceptible to the journalists. And even economists were divided on this particular issue. Not that the crisis was not foreseen, but it was not seen to be in that kind of magnitude in terms of scale and timing and intensity. There were differences of opinion about the crisis. So for a journalist to take notice of these tectonic changes, which are very subtle, I think it's asking too much.
I'm not sure I agree with you. How many believe that the changes going on were very subtle, or do you think that they were more apparent? How many think that the changes that were going on in the economy were subtle? Raise your hands. Okay, only a few people. How many feel that journalists should have been onto this more? Raise your hands. So there you have the vast majority of people who really believe they should have been onto this more. Stephen, your thoughts on this? Ehsan, and then Martha, you all have something to add. Yeah.
Well, none of us are prophets, and we did, as Martha said, maybe analyze in great detail a great number of things, but none of us could see the future. It's great in hindsight now to look back and find faults with ourselves and others, where the bankers themselves, the regulatory agencies, had no real idea either the extent of the damage or really how to limit it. But we're along